On the back of a great question that came through in the comments on a previous video, today is going to be all about how to do altitude training properly, what altitude simulation might be like, or can we simulate it here at sea level, and really how to get the most out of any type of altitude training that you might be trying to do, and why it sort of works for endurance performance, and why athletes go through these processes. The other thing I'm going to talk about today is also what do we need to avoid when it comes to altitude, because there is obviously a lot of talk about this topic, and there might be some, I guess, easy ways to do things, or what seems like easy ways to do things, but do they actually work in terms of producing that benefit? That's what we're going to cover today. So hopefully it answers the question, everything you need to know about altitude training for performance. Hey guys, Nick here. Welcome back to the channel, talking science of endurance and everything sports science in general. Welcome to the channel. If you're watching for the first time, please consider subscribing down below. And if you haven't checked out all the previous videos that have been up on the channel, I highly recommend it. Just keep my name down below, click on that. It'll take you straight to my channel where you can watch everything that's been coming up over the last little while. I've got more than 50 videos up for you guys to check out. So make sure you go check those out, leave some comments, ask some questions. It's been really great to interact with all of you so far. As I said in the intro, today's video is on the back of a question that was left in the comments a few videos ago about altitude training and simulating altitude, and really just covering the basics of it. So that's what we're going to tap into today. And I understand a few of you, or plenty of you who are watching, might not be able to go and do some altitude at the moment, or maybe looking into it when things in terms of restrictions or lockdowns in your areas might be easing. You might be able to go up and do some altitude to try and get some benefits. So I just wanted to talk about I guess the three, I guess, keys in my head of how does it work, how do we do it properly in terms of the physiology, what are we trying to achieve here, how do we actually gain those altitude benefits, but then also some things to stay away from to actually get a benefit, and not just go into the sort of gimmicky type stuff that we see a lot, because it can get quite confusing. I completely agree. It's difficult at times when you're not quite sure what is real and what is kind of a bit of marketing smoke and mirrors, to actually understand what's going to give you the best benefit and actually make a difference in terms of your performance. So first of all, we're going to cover how does it actually work from a physiological perspective. What is altitude training trying to achieve? And the main goal is we're trying to improve our oxygen carrying capacity through the bloodstream. So when we talk about things like VO2 max or our ability of the aerobic system, we talk about our ability to take in the first place, so breathe in, transport through the blood and through the cardiovascular system, and then use at the muscle. So mainly we're focused on this transport mechanism, increasing the number of red blood cells we have to be able to then, the hemoglobin in those red blood cells, take up oxygen, bind to it, carry that to where it needs to go. And the more red blood cells we have, the more hemoglobin we have, the more oxygen we can transport through the bloodstream. That means more delivery to the working muscles. Whether those muscles actually take up that delivery and whether we can diffuse into the bloodstream in the first place, they're two different components that are mainly going to come from a training perspective. But it's the type of thing, if we can maximize one component in the middle, it's going to help the transport mechanism. It is going to give us some sort of boost in performance. Whether it's only a 1, 2, 3%, that is still going to be beneficial when we're back down at sea level. So that's the main thing we're trying to achieve here. How does it happen? When we go up to altitude, there's a distinct thing that changes. The air pressures change, and we get what's called less dense air. So the air is, I guess, a lot thinner. If anyone's been up a really high mountain, gone up to altitude, you notice it's more difficult to breathe because there's just less volume of air. So that means there's less, and the pressures of air have changed because there's less concentrations of all the different gases, oxygen, nitrogen, hydrogen, a whole bunch of things that are floating around the atmosphere. And what that means is there's less overall oxygen molecules. So it is harder to then breathe because to begin with, there's less air. And that's the key component that causes the stimulation of naturally occurring EPO in the body to go, hey, we don't have much air in the environment. We're trying to get as much oxygen and extract as much as we can and transport every last bit of oxygen we're getting into our system. Let's produce some EPO in the body, which is going to stimulate the production of red blood cells. More red blood cells means we can transport more oxygen at the end of the day. So it's a naturally occurring process, this. So when we go up, we're trying to just get this stimulation of red blood cells. And how do we actually then achieve that properly? Well, it's not just a case of you go up and find the biggest hill you can find in your local area, or the biggest, what you might consider a mountain in your local area. It's not quite that simple, because we actually need at least sort of 2,100 meters above sea level, if not higher than 2,400 meters above sea level. So we're going up quite a long way. You need to be up quite high. So you can't just go to any hill. You have to go to a solid set of mountains, which can be sometimes, for a lot of people, quite a long way away. And this is where it gets a bit tricky in terms of the practical side of things. And are you able to actually get out there for enough period of time? The second part of it is, other than just being at that minimum of 21 to 2,400 meters to get some sort of benefit in the first place, you need a large amount of exposure. Typically, you need at least sort of 3 weeks worth of exposure for about 12 hours a day is going to give you best bang for buck in terms of getting the altitude benefit. So again, really impractical, if you like, and not useful if you have to go somewhere to do that. And that's why we have things like altitude chambers and altitude houses, tents, the works, where athletes can sleep in that. You can get portable ones you can set up in your bedroom, over your bed. You can set up rooms. I've worked with an athlete previously and coached an athlete who set up their entire bedroom to be basically an altitude chamber. So they had their desk in there and they do their daily tasks as much as they could in that room. Obviously, you don't necessarily have to go to that extent, but they were really quite serious about it in terms of getting as much exposure in that higher altitude environment. And essentially how we simulate is we just pump in more other, I guess, additional gases, things like nitrogen and hydrogen, and we change the composition of the air. So there's, I guess, the same amount of oxygen as you would normally have at sea level, but because we pumped all these other gases in, the concentrations, there's a total change and the pressures change, and that's how we get that simulation of altitude. The downside, I guess, of going up to an altitude camp, other than being impractical, you actually have to go somewhere, is that you also then have to do all your training at altitude, which can be a bit of a detriment to performance, because when we're at altitude, obviously, as I spoke about before, there's less available oxygen because the air's thinner, makes it more difficult to breathe as it is. You go and train, that's going to heavily restrict your training intensity, which is then going to change what happens from an adaptation perspective in the muscle, a bit of cardiovascular as well in terms of how hard the heart's pumping, cardiac output, stroke volume, but then also your respiratory system changes, pulmonary diffusion. All of these things are going to change, and ultimately you go and try up and do, let's say, your VO2 max intervals at near maximal intensity. You're going to end up at a much lower intensity when you're up there because you're limited. And the classic case is the Mexico City Olympics, that will be a one-off event that you see in that Olympics alone, held at about 2,300 meters of altitude. All the endurance events were massively reduced in terms of their performances, and it's some of the worst performances we've seen across the board in a single Olympics for endurance events. Anything that was really heavily aerobic. Why? Because there's just not as much oxygen. So intensity reduced and athletes were slower. So it's the type of thing that doing your training up at altitude, if you have to, isn't necessarily a good idea. Being able to live in an altitude chamber though, an altitude tent and house, you can do as much exposure. You can get your 12 hours exposure a day by doing sleeping, daily activities, things like that. But then you can go out and maintain your training intensity out at a normal sea level environment. So you get the best of both worlds. So it's what we call a live high, train low mentality, rather than a train high, live low is the worst way to do it. But we want to live high, get as much exposure in just our daily activity tasks, because it doesn't necessarily matter. We're just trying to get altitude exposure and stressing the body to some extent. Train low so we can maintain training intensity and get all the benefits we've talked about in previous videos about just general training adaptations, getting better at using oxygen in the working muscle. There's even been some research to show that you go up to altitude and basically, instead of, when we talk about things like lactate threshold, which I've done a video on, I might link it above, when we talk about lactate threshold and we want to move that to the right of the graph and push that out, going up to altitude actually brings that back to the left, and it's almost making you closer to what an untrained athlete would look like rather than a more trained athlete. So that gives you a bit of perspective. The last thing I want to cover here is some of the things out there that just aren't going to give you a benefit, and almost a bit gimmicky and sort of a bit of smoke and mirrors of, we use the term altitude very loosely to then try and get you to buy into a methodology. And there's a couple of things that you need to really stay away from that aren't going to give you a benefit, and I'll explain the reasons why here as well. The first one being these training masks. I'm not going to call them altitude masks because they're not. They actually have to be legally called training masks now because there was a lawsuit around they don't actually simulate altitude, so they can't. But essentially all these do, you would have seen them, I might put a picture up on the screen. Basically they're just restricting airflow. What does that mean? That's just restricting your ventilation at a normal sea level environment. Yes, there is going to be some benefit in terms of respiratory muscle training. For endurance athletes, you don't need it. It's so minimal for an endurance athlete. The only time we sort of see a benefit is if you've had a significant car accident and your lungs and everything's been crushed and you really have to rebuild that. Maybe that's a bit different. But for the typical endurance athlete, doing your hard, high intensity efforts where you're breathing heavy anyway is going to be more than enough of a challenge and a stress in the body to develop those respiratory muscles. Maybe in things like MMA combat sports to simulate being choked out is another example you might want to use these. But in terms of what they don't simulate that pressure difference I was talking about before. They don't simulate thinner air. Putting a mask on your face isn't going to change what happens in this room around me in terms of the oxygen concentration. It just stops me from breathing in as much total air. So there's no trigger in the body to sense that difference of pressure gradient. There's no difference in the body to sense there's not as much oxygen in the air. It's just I'm getting less air in. So it's almost like breathing through a straw. That's not going to simulate altitude. So those training masks are a complete waste. I wouldn't buy into them. And I still see athletes use them, and it still kind of pains me as a sports scientist to think that that's something still out there in our industry. The second one as well is I've seen it pop up a few times, and I'm sure each of these places have their own reasons for using it, but in terms of going to places where you can go and do an hour's training session in an altitude environment, I think those places as well are quite misinformed in terms of the benefits. Like I said, the actual benefits of altitude and the stimulus required is 12 hours exposure a day at 21 to 2400 meters for about 3 weeks. Going and doing a 1 hour session once a week or twice a week is nowhere near enough stimulus. And doing your training session, as I said before, in altitude is actually going to reduce the intensity you can work at, increase the RPE. So yeah, it's going to be a hard session. But when we're talking about training for an adaptation rather than training just for the sake of fatiguing, they're two very different things. Training for adaptation is going to lead to better performance. Training just for the sake of fatigue is just going to make you fatigued. There's only two paths to it. So those types of places where it's like you go into a gym and you do an hour's training session in altitude, they might be good for simulating what the sensation is like. So if you've never been to altitude before, or you're training to go up and you're going to go skiing or snowboarding or something up in the Alps, or you're going for a hike, but you want to just get a taste for what high altitude might feel like, that might be a good option to go to. And I'm not saying they're completely awful for things like that. For trying to get an altitude benefit as an athlete, trying to get better in terms of performance and get those 1, 2, 3% gains, you're better off going and doing it correctly and not just trying to go the cheap way out of 1 hour a week, because it's just not going to work. The last thing I'm going to leave you here with is these effects are not chronic. So what I mean by that is they're not going to last forever. You go up and do the altitude protocol, 3 weeks, 12 hours a day, 21 to 2400 minimum. You do everything right. After a couple of weeks back at sea level, those effects are basically back to where you were at the start. Everything comes back to normal. Why? Because the body's then now adapting to that new stimulus again. It's readapting to what sea level is. You ideally need to go up to an altitude camp a couple of weeks out from race day, come back down, pretty much race within the 7 to 14 day period to maximize what that increased hemoglobin, the increased red blood cells have done within the body. After that, a couple of weeks later, 3-4 weeks later, you're pretty much back to baseline, and then kind of waste of going up to the camp, because the body's not going to have a chronic effect there. They will just constantly adjust. So keeping that in mind, that's everything around altitude. Hopefully that gives you a bit of a summary about how it actually works, what the physiology is behind it, the correct protocols and ways to go about it, and then some of the things to avoid in this space. I think it's a space that gets talked about a hell of a lot, and we need to be really careful when we understand what are the different things contributing. Have you had any experience with altitude training? Keen to hear your thoughts down below. Have you jumped in an altitude chamber or tent before, been up to an altitude camp? What are some things that you thought or maybe learned through this video that you thought were right and maybe you're doing wrong? Let me know in the comments down below. Always keen to hear everyone's thoughts and ideas and have a bit of a discussion. As always, please consider subscribing to the channel. Really appreciate the support so far and want to continue to grow the channel. So everyone who jumps on and clicks that red button, I really appreciate it. That is it for today, and we'll see you in the next one.